All right, what's good, everybody? So, there are going to be things that I mentioned here that may be a hot take for some people, but I'm going to try to go through this as quick as possible because having a whole overview and discussion is something that I'm not trying to have, especially since I already mentioned these things in a different video, which I'm going to have that in the description if y'all want to check it out. It's pretty long, but it is for those that like to have a more in-depth like analysis of like a character or certain things, which this I'm gonna keep it as simple as I possibly can. So it is gonna be touching on a topic that has kind of recently like came out. Tokido, you know we all know now that he's not sticking to Akuma and he's decided to stick with Ken. Now I can actually relate to this because I've also mained Ken, and since the start of when Akuma released, I've been playing him pretty much nonstop. However, despite how much time I've already put into him, despite how much we know now, I still believe that Akuma does need a bit more time to flesh out. Yet, I still think it's fair to finally, have a discussion on where, he stands overall in the grand scheme of things, especially in Street Fighter 6. And I can relate to Keto in wanting to just stick with Ken, and to believe why Ken overall is better, I'd say, despite what I've mentioned before in a previous video. This guy right here he's just too solid, and there are so many there's a lot more risk and gaps involved with Akuma that it's not something that people want to hear, because this guy right here is one of the most badass characters in fighting game history. But we have to look at things objectively, and maybe you're not even aware, or maybe you can't even fathom in what I'm saying, but those at a certain level and with a certain level of like I guess those who kind of have like a more clear like clairvoyance view of like the game will be able to understand what I'm saying. But here's some things that I mentioned before, like this, for example, like these tools right here that I'm showing right now, this punch, this teep, this in some situations, the air fireball, this chop move and stuff, like they're all good and stuff. But the thing is that with these tools, they have a lot more risk tied to them, just because of the fact that this can be a perfect parry, and I'm actually going to give that example too. Well, there we go. Like that happens a lot more than you think, and it's not really the hardest thing in the world to get either. Like me, like that was me barely really like trying to fish that out, and I was able to get it at least twice out of like the 5 times that I did try it. So it's doable, and it's definitely something that Akuma, like those that play Akuma, need to watch out for. And we all know that this guy gets taken out pretty quick because of that damage, that 10% decrease in his health. And you really do start to feel the weight of how much that really affects Akuma, considering that everybody's doing, on their biggest combos on average, if they dump all their meter, even without critical art or punish counter scaling, they're gonna do 6k easily, unless you're like Kimberly. But that's the majority of the cast, right? So at 10% to like 6k, that's 70%. You're essentially taking away Akuma's 3/4 of Akuma's health, which it opens the door for a lot of people to become a part of the two-touch club against Akuma for that reason. Ken doesn't need to worry about that. Not only that, his moves don't have, that same level of risk involved. Like, we all know, like, his riskier moves would have to be this, the Jinrai, and the Dragon Lash, right? And I wouldn't even say, like, these have much risk to them, too, because the difference is between Ken and Akuma's is that the spacing of them. Because this right here, I'm -7, right? And the low, it's -5. So on paper, like any light, some mediums, if it's within 7 frames, which I'd say 3 characters probably have it. They're able to punish. They should, on paper, and through the mathematics, get that punish, right? Even with the low, which is -5, right? Standing lights or even jabs. You will not be in the, like, from here, I can't even hit Akuma. So he's not going to be able to get that punish at all, right? The spacing is important. Akuma does not have that luxury, and I've mentioned that even Ryu had that. He was able to establish that spacing too, because of the donkey kick, which it's still a riskier move than the Jinrai, but it is a move that you can kind of poke out in certain times, just to like get enough spacing. Akuma's version of like what Ken's Jinrai and Ryu's donkey kick is, or the Hasho is this, the animate fist, but this is not a good move to like just throw out in neutral. It's purely just like combo. It's purely just combo utility, because this right here, it's -8 for Akuma, so even the slowest of medium kicks, which I'm not sure if -8, if 8 frames is the slowest medium kick, but even Ryu's medium kick can hit that, for example. This is -4, so any jab, a 4-frame jab, can hit that. And I'm -2, so he can't be punished for it. But it does mean that Akuma loses his turn. So while Ken can throw this in neutral, and it works as pressure because the spacing allows him to, be safe. But not only that, if your opponent still attempts to throw out a button, which let's say I throw this empty. Well, I'm still in range there, but well, that was a bad example. Like, that wouldn't even happen really in most situations either. As you can see, it's still not free if your opponent will be spaced correctly or throw the right button. Crouching medium kick. Actually, this will work into what mostly happens in matches, and something that I've noticed too. Oh, but I should mention, if this does connect and it gets counter hit, if the opponent does try to mash through it, like, I can get that combo. But one thing I should mention too is this: like, I'm safe right there, even if it's a lot. So while, okay, maybe that wasn't the best example, but it is to show that Ken's Jinrai does have gaps, but most of the time the opponent won't just be throwing that out in between, like the Jinrai. Most of the time, like, these situations would happen instead. Like, those situations would happen, right? Or they'll be inclined to to try to throw out a button to. They'll be inclined to throw a button to kind of mash through the Jinrai, which, as I showed there in my terrible showcase example, that you can frame trap your opponent and get a counter hit combo off of it if they do decide to mash, or if not, like they'll get hit by it and you can still continue Jinrai pressure from it, which happens a lot more often than the other scenario, which happened where I actually got beat out of it. So while there is certain gaps there, they're not easy to take advantage of. Like they're not the easiest to get, especially since you still have to worry about the follow-ups here and there, or whether or not, like, you know, let's say your opponent decides to, or Akuma decides to do this instead, right? Like that can happen. But then, like, with this, you know, there's no follow-up after, unless you do that, and I'm really punishable there. I'm really punishable there, but at worst, that's at worst, but at most, like, I'm still punishable even by a 4-frame jab, which it's still punishable by a lot. Like, that's still a thing too, right? That's pretty much guaranteed, actually. So already his pressure in that sense is not good. Not even the spacing is good. Like, the most he has, which Takedo and Gachikun and Mago had mentioned, was the fireballs. That's all he has, right? That's all he has. It's not, you know, it is good, but it doesn't compensate for the fact that everything else pretty much has, you know, there is a gap somewhere to be found with these moves. Even whether you just, like, anti-air it, or you get a perfect parry from it, or, you know, whether, like, you get a jump in when it comes to this, right? Which, it's not the hardest thing to do either, especially if you preemptively know they're gonna throw a fireball in, and at most you'll either, like, trade in the air, you'll just knock them out of it, like, in this way, which now that's a thing too. So it's really hurting Akuma in that sense, while Ken doesn't have, you know, to worry about any of these things. And there are things that I've personally, like, noticed as I played Akuma, the more time I've spent with him, right? And I really wanted to believe, I really wanted to really find, like, you know, my rhythm with the character, and where I know I'd be able to essentially do more than what Ken could do. But the fact is that while it's not like he can't establish the same type of offense that like Ken can, and honestly, it's in some ways it's still even better than Ryu's. But what helps Ryu and Ken better than Akuma is the fact that they can either establish the spacing, the plus frames, or it's the fact that when they do get hit by their openings, they will not get punished for it as much as this character does. And I don't think I've mentioned it, or I probably have mentioned it already, but at a certain level, like, anything that whiffs, you know, in front of your opponent in specific ranges, if your opponent is the kind who will easily take advantage of whiffing this in front of them, they'll do it, and you'll lose the game for that. And that only happens at a certain level of Street Fighter, which most players, I'm pretty sure, are not even like experiencing that yet, which is why we get takes like, you know, Akuma's fireball, Akuma's like command grab is like really hard to like deal with. But you know, if you're that kind of player, you know, you should be taking into account of like the things that I'm mentioning here. And this is still like a simple, these are some of the faults that he has on a very like surface level still, and from my POV. Like there's I've definitely broken these things down more in depth in like a different video, which I'll have in the description, right? But for what it is right now is like, you know, the whole overview of it is, from my point of view, is Akuma is not only a lot more harder to play with, just because of like he has to, you know, rely on like playing safer, but also he has to make sure all his decisions are done perfectly so he doesn't get punished for it. But he also has to make sure like as the player, your defense has to be so on point, so when you don't get hit as often, because when you do get hit, it doesn't matter what you do, you're gonna eat more damage than everybody else. Like that's just a given right there. But with Ken, I had mentioned that there's not as much risk, or for the gaps that he does have, it's a lot more harder to take advantage of it as the opponent to Ken. And he has an extra layer on top of the things that he has, right? So, you know, Ken is a lot more safer to play, and a lot more punishing. It's a lot more punishing. He's a lot less punishable is what I meant. My bad. I got distracted by something. Which is why I believe Tokido overall decided to just stick with the Ken. And that's something that even I'm doing right now. But that's not to downplay any character. Like that's not a downplay on any character. Like people throw that around a lot just because they hear one thing that people don't agree with, which is something that I hate. Like if you think I'm downplaying Akuma, then just leave the video, honestly. I don't care. I really don't care. Like this is my point of view, right? These are things that I've noticed, and that's something that I've seen not only by myself but like other players too. So there's something universal to the things that I'm saying that are true. Like you can't deny that, you know, the health thing is very noticeable on this character. The issues on his well, maybe not issues, but the differences between like the buttons of the Shotos are noticeable right away. Even if we were to just to take things between Akuma and Ryu, right? Like the ranges on these are either the same or better on every other Shoto but Akuma, aside from probably this button right here. But this is not only slower, it's also it's like you know, you can't really get much out of it other than the target combo, or on counter hit you may get a drive rush in, but it's riskier than even like, let's say this button for example, because of the spacing thing. And if we were to go back on like the buttons that he is talked mostly about, like this button right here, right? What is the difference between that button and Ken and Ryu's? Because they both pretty much have the same range. They're both pretty much cancelable. So what's the difference? One frame. Akuma's startup is 9. Ken and Ryu's is 10. It's just a 1 frame difference. But if I were to throw anything out beforehand, like this right here will beat it out easily. well, maybe not this, but it will catch Akuma more often against his other tools versus, let's say, like if they were to both throw out this at the same time. Ken and Ryu still both have, like, look at this spacing right here, and then I'm able to throw this out too, right? And let's say this does connect, I could level 3. And that is still hit confirmable too. Like, you're able to see visually, like, you know, whether it hits or not, to be able to confirm that, which most players don't train for anyways, but I do recommend that for everybody that plays Ken. So that pretty much is it right now. Like, Ken overall is just a less riskier and in some cases a bit more rewarding than Akuma to play, despite the differences between damage. But I'd say if you were looking for that too, like, Ryu and Akuma do pretty much the same amount of damage anyway, so you know, there's a lot more unfavorable things to Akuma in this game specifically than there is to play Ryu and Ken. And the discussion still is, like, whether, you know, who's better between Ken and Ryu, but I guess now people are still starting to see that this character is the same. So maybe in everybody's minds, like, people still fear Ken. Honestly, I'm not even entirely against the idea of, like, Ken being the best. I'm not even sure where everybody else stands in overall, but one thing that I can say is that if every Shoto is pretty much, like, within top 10 in my eyes, I'd say even Ryu at this point, because he only just got better, right? And I guess his only fault is really being, like, a character that has no, while being able to establish plus frames, he still doesn't have that like a command grab tool in which you can literally just crack open your opponent for playing too much defense, right? But the way that he can establish plus frames is in some ways better than Ken's, because of the Hashos, right? And his fireball is still, like, a good one, right? It's still really good. And Akuma, you know, he still has this. He still has things that make him good, but those gaps really, really do mean a lot. And I know I've had people disagree with me on that. Nothing's going to change my mind, just because of the fact that with the nature of this game, like, you know, it's easy to just get punishes here and there. Everybody's going to be doing 6k damage, so you will definitely feel those differences. I promise you that. If maybe not now, you know, if you haven't reached that point of the game and where you're actively playing, like, careful footsies, you know, it's all perception at the end of the day. But this is my take on it. Just like last time, like, you know, I may be inclined to believe something different later on if I fully discover what it is. And do I think you can thrive with this character? So, from my personal experience, because I actually have ran Akuma in bracket, I believe yes. I don't believe anybody is at the level yet in which you can. And I know Daigo had brought him up for a tournament recently, and he was actually doing pretty fine. But what's the difference between everybody else and a player like Daigo, right? Like, most of the time they will rely on their years of experience and fundamentals to just blow through the rest of, like, you know, blow through the average, like, competitive player. average competitive player, mind you. But, you know, not everybody is at that peak when it comes to abilities in Street Fighter. So let's take you and match you up against with somebody who's of your equal level of, skill as a player, right? If you were to pick Akuma and your opponent were to pick Ryu or Ken, on average, your opponent's going to be beating you more often. That's the way I see it. I maybe it's not exactly what I mean, but because there's, like I mentioned, there are still things that there are to like discover about this character, but it's definitely what definitely is there in the open right now is that Akuma definitely requires a lot more to play, and there is a lot more risk to it. So that's going to be it for now. Like, later on, like I mentioned, I may change my opinion because, things are constantly developing. So we'll see later down the line how I feel. So I'm glad for y'all for watching this, and I'll be seeing y'all later. Peace.